Hey guys, so today I'm just going to be doing some quick sketches. You're welcome to draw along with me. I'm going to try to keep each one under 10 minutes or so. It's really just to show you how to build up a very generalized sketch, whether you're practicing gesture, structure, some other things, anything like that. So today I'm going to be using Frank Frazetta mostly for all my figures because he has such a good sense of gesture and movement. What he does really well is that he actually designs the model. And because it didn't really work extensively from photographs, almost at all in fact, he was able to invent very gestural figures because he had complete control of what they'd look like using his imagination. When you're drawing your first gestural lines, you want to think about really large rhythm lines along the body. So what are rhythm lines? Rhythm lines are just things that connect different points. So if you got this point, and this point, then it feels like there's a general curve. So if you ever took calculus or any sort of statistic class, I'm sure you heard of line of best fit, and that's really what this is. All you're doing is that you're connecting different bumps on the body to large lines. Now, this could be a bump of the shoulder, outlaying of the hip, some other things like that. Anything that there's a point on the body and it creates a curve. So, for example, here's a large curve down the body. There's a curve up to her shoulder from her hip, goes down to her arm. Now, when I'm thinking about these big gestural lines, you don't have to get super detailed or accurate. You're really just getting the main pose of the body. I'm just going to keep everything very abstract. So next would be the hair. Now, an interesting thing is that a lot of people don't think about the hair as part of the gesture, but it certainly is because it's an element in the painting. And in fact, even though the crazy part is that people don't think about the hair as part of the gesture, but anything can be involved in the gesture, even outside of the body. Now you can see that you could use 3 characters, for example, in a scene to create a gestural line. Frank has a little bit of a dynamic going up here. Now he could have used like something to bend it up here, like a very dark value that bended like that. And that would have created this large flowing line through the 3 characters, but you can see that it goes beyond just the individual figures in the composition. It's anything that works abstractly. Like you can even see that this branch down here kind of flows into the figure. So everything feels like it's interconnected, and that creates a lot of motion and movement. Now, this isn't fully gesture because I am adding a bit of structure to it and some shapes. So a Foley gesture would be, it would look more like a stick figure. I'm not really doing exactly that because I'm going to turn this into an actual drawing, but you're welcome to look up what only gesture is and apply that to your own drawings. So you can see with the hair here, there's a lot of inlets, right? There's a lot of details, there's a lot of shines, there's a lot of like individual strands and stuff. And when somebody's drawing that, they might get very overwhelmed, and it makes sense, right? This is even a painting, so it's an abstracted version of whatever, if he was working from a photograph, it would have looked like in real life. He would have seen much more detail than even this, but if you're copying this, it's still a lot to visually look at, let alone paint or draw. But the way that you can simplify things is just by getting the general shape of it. So you can see the general shape of the head has this S curve, and then it goes in like this, and then very simply goes in like that. And then you want to just erase it and keep the good shape that you have, just to clean up the drawing a bit so it doesn't start getting messy and you don't confuse wrong lines with right lines, etc. I'm sure you've all been there. Now, once I'm here, I'm going to start simplifying a lot of the lines now that I have a correct sort of proportion into a bit of sexier lines. And it doesn't really matter what the subject is. It could be a woman, it could be, a lion, whatever. You always want to have really nice curves and straights and design within your line work. And that could look like C's, S's, and straights. And it doesn't matter really what you're doing. You always want the curves on the figure to be extremely simple. So you can see here, Frank actually made the entire side of her body here, just this really simple S curve, starting right from the armpit down to the hips and then down to the knees here, right? And an interesting thing he did as well, and in fact, photographers use this a lot. If you look up photography posing tips, then you'll see what a lot of photographers do is that they'll make the knees narrower or the shoulders narrower to make the hips look bigger. Or for men, they'll tell them to turn their body so that their hip is actually visually smaller, so that their shoulders look wider. So there's something like this. You have the two shoulders, right? Two arms is bad, but so you have the hips facing towards us like this, right? And then you have the frontal facing torso up here. And what that does for men is that it'll make their shoulders look a lot broader and they'll have that nice triangular body. Now for women, what you do is that you bring in the knees, and because you're bringing in the knees, it makes the hips look wider by proportion. Very interesting thing is that in a lot of anime, if you're interested in this sort of thing, a lot of anime, they'll make the women's knees turn in. And it's a very weird thing, but if you have like, you know, the basic underwear shape, then they'll make the knee go in like this, and they'll have the feet turned in. And it's a very weird thing, but the reason why it looks aesthetic, and a lot of anime drawers do it this way, and even Frank Frazetta did this a lot too. If you bring the knees in like this, then it makes the hips look larger. So it's another example of that. So when you're posing, you really want to think about a lot of these visual tricks. A lot of stuff in art is very relative. So whatever is dark only looks dark as there is bright. Things only look as colorful as it is, you know, dull and generally muted. Just like this ground right here, you can see it's very tan. You can see that it's just dirty yellows and oranges. But then he adds in a flash of super saturated color, and that makes it look really, really brilliant. But that's really just an illusion. And the reason why this looks so dark and this looks so bright is because they're so extreme, but they're next to each other. The reason why her hips look so wide is because her knees are so narrow. So in art, if you want something to work, you always have to have something opposing it to complement it. Now, Frazetta also said that you always want your work to border on the abstract. And what he meant by that is that you're not actually saying everything very, very literally. You're not outlining every single toe, every single mark, whatever. You want everything to kind of meld together in the periphery of the painting. So you can see that her hand here is just like two little flicks, right? It's really not that complex. You can see here with the lion, his entire back here is just this one shape, right? Everything does not need a lot of detail in painting. And when you over detail everything and you don't let a lot of stuff kind of flow away in obscurity, then what happens is that you lose a sense of focus and direction in your painting. And then it generally the point becomes ambiguous and it becomes more aesthetically unpleasing. Now, another thing that a lot of people do is that they'll get the gesture correct, and then they start fixing it, and they fix it and fix it and fix it and fix it. And when you fix it and fix it and fix it, what happens is that you lose the original sense of simplicity and motion. So if I were to really go in here and make everything perfect, quote unquote, and I used a lot of like scratchy lines like that, then what happens is that you lose the original sense of simplicity, and it looks overworked and ugly generally. So you really want to make sure that you're not overworking things. And if you do overwork it, you have to do it in an intelligent way so you can hide all that overwork. For example, I know that this is too wide on the back, so I'm going to pull that in a little bit. Now, at this point, it's not a perfect drawing, obviously, but I'm going to start putting in masses of tone. And when you get to a point where you have the drawing okay, and it's not perfect, but you know, you get the general shapes right, you have the proportions right, for example, then you can really start working in the masses of tone, and then you can see a lot of the drawing mistakes. And this is one of the reasons when you're painting that you don't want to spend a lot of time on the underdrawing, because if you spend too much time on the underdrawing, you make it perfect, then once you start laying in masses of tone, you might realize that there's something horrendously wrong with the drawing. And well, there's other reasons you also don't want to do that, is because you become fearful of covering up your canvas and then it looks restricted, just like these marks. It looks very fearful. You don't want that in your paintings either. But so I'm going to start laying the masses of tone, and you can see that there's a lot of complexities here. You can see that there's folds of dress, and there's all this stuff. But I'm going to think about it very simply as a very basic shape. I'm not going to think about all those folds and stuff. I'm going to think about the very, very simple shapes. So I'm going to omit all this crap going on, and I'm just going to add it in later so it doesn't confuse me now. Now, a thing you can do with your pencil is that when you actually shave it off or you use a lead holder, you can use the edge of your pencil and you can cover in large masses of tone without adding in a lot of complexity to it. So when you're using a sharp pencil and you're going in like this, you have to get every single line perfect so you don't have overlapping tones like that dark fight right there. So to avoid that, you should really start sharpening your pencil the correct way, and Proko has a good video on that, how to sharpen your pencil. Or you can just use a lead holder. You use the edge of the pencil, and the edge of the pencil is much more concave. It's almost like that. So if we went like a microscope onto the pencil, you'd see that what you're laying down is resting on the paper like that. So what happens is that at these edges where it's touching, it's very soft and it's unevenly kind of spreading around the graphite or charcoal. So what that does is that it makes the lines less harsh, and it also lets you put in a lot more tone because you're not putting it like this is what the tip of a pencil would look like, right? You can see that this lays in a lot more tone than that. And this tip would also add in a lot of sharp lines like that versus softer lines with the edge. So when you're doing gesture drawing especially, I would really suggest using the edge of your pencil or lead roller. Now for hair, the same thing happens. That you just want to lay in the large tonal masses, and from there you can start adding the more intricate shapes. But if you don't get the large tonal masses correct, then what happens is that it ends up looking wrong. So what do I mean by the large tonal masses? Well, if you think about the head as a sphere, right? Then light's going to be hitting on it like that, right? You're going to have your shadow, your little core shadow, your midtones, whatever. But what happens is that you need to think about the head as that simple form, because you can see even with all this texture and stuff on top of it, the general form is still the same, right? For example, this lighting would be more like this. Right? But the lighting there is still really simple. It just has a lot of hair on it, so it distracts you and it complicates things. But it really doesn't have to be that complicated. If you can just simplify it like this and just get in that general massive darkness, then you can just lay it in. And eventually when you started adding in more intricate masses and shapes and stuff, then it's going to start looking more and more like hair. Now you can see another thing people script a lot with when they're drawing the tonal masses is that they make the darks not dark enough. So you can see that on this it's almost jet black. Now if I was going to do a value accurate drawing, which I'm not because I don't want to waste that much lead, then I would make this all the way black, because that's essentially what Frazetta was using here. I just broke the pencil down. Anyway, so he basically made this black, and when you make it that dark, you can see that this is definitely the wrong tone. And then when you have your darkest dark on your canvas or your your draftsman table or whatever on your paper, then what you can do is that you can start seeing what the relative values are. So we were talking about how everything in drawing is relative, right? Tones are also relative, especially really subtle tones. So this might look really light, but if you put this anywhere near the light section, it looks super dark. It'll look almost black pretty much if you extract this out and put it on there. And that's a part of what makes drawing and painting especially hard, is that everything is so relative that you really need to slowly build things up, and you'll find that a lot of your work that you thought was correct, it looked correct, wasn't actually correct. Now, this one I actually just recently did a video on, so that was very interesting. I talked a lot about the gestural curves that he was using more compositionally rather than constructively, and that was very, very interesting. But right now, I guess I'm going to draw it. So this one really illustrates the point that I was trying to put down earlier, which was the fact that gestural curves are just so easy to pick up and use in your drawings, and it makes them much more accurate. So you can see that one, bam, right down the arm, right? And there's no way Frazetta could have made this kind of motion with a still pose, right? He had to invent a very gestural pose. It's not even a matter of drawing. Something that will help you draw anatomy a lot quicker and more accurately is by studying Bridgman and a lot of the shapes that he used to construct the body. So he simplified the muscle groups into certain shapes, and I'm no expert on this topic. There's a lot more people who are a lot more educated than me, like modern day James. For example, on YouTube, I'd suggest checking him out. But what Bridgman did essentially, from my understanding, is that he would break down all the muscle groups into very simple shapes. So he'd make the calf a very simple calf and foot, really simple shape like that, right? And then, you know, the thigh, something like that. So when you simplify everything down to that kind of level, then it makes your drawings look a lot more aesthetic, because you're getting rid of a lot of the superfluous detail that's unnecessary in everyday life. And you're also adding on stylization, where you're making everything that looks cool even cooler, everything that looks colorful even more colorful. And that's what art really is. You know, it's taking everyday things that are aesthetic and bringing them and fleshing them out in every painting that you do. So if you can make every single calf look idealized, for example, then it's going to make your paintings and drawings look a lot more aesthetic. You can see this arm has this really nice S curve to it. And you want to be thinking about all the curves when you're actually drawing. Because not only does it make your drawings look more accurate, but it also makes them look less dead. So you want to just break everything down to really, really simple curves. That's really what gesture is doing, right? And it's capturing the essence of what's happening, and it's exaggerating it even further. Now, it's really easy to learn gesture from people like Frank Frazetta, who are intentionally doing all this abstraction and exaggeration. But where the real legwork comes in is learning this, and this is your training wheels, and then you go into actual images and poses that you see in real life, and then you try to draw out the gesture, and then you try to exaggerate it. So I don't even know if the human form could really contort this way. The thing that Frazetta did is that he made it even more exaggerated. He made this curve even more simple and even more curvy, right? And by doing that, it makes things look really, really special and a lot better than real life. And that's really what you're aiming for when you're designing an image. You can see even in things like clothing and, you know, this barbarian's, whatever the hell that is, his belt and stuff. It's very, very simple shapes. And Frazetta was good at really simplifying the shapes, especially with his wardrobe that he would choose and invent, right? What he would do is that he'd make everything really, really simple. So like this shape right here, it's just like a straight, and then it's just kind of spiky thing, you know. But it's really, really simple, right? It's not any more complex than it has to be. And Frazetta wasn't scared of using detail, right? He was using detail over here. He has shines and glimmers and, you know, these little teeth and all this other stuff. But he also has areas of no detail. And that's, you know, in the background, for example, there's mountains in the background here suggested. But if he had added in every single nook and cranny and little detail here, then what would happen is that it would look less aesthetic. But he puts in a lot of detail in some areas, and then he doesn't put in detail in other areas. And that's what makes his shapes look so aesthetic and simple and complex at the same time with that sophistication. Now I'm going to start laying in my tonal masses. And laying in the tonal masses does not have to be a slow process, especially right at the beginning. It should actually go extremely quickly, very rapidly. And to teach yourself to go rapidly, you need to just do it. Don't be afraid to draw over your sketch, ruin it, whatever. When you spend 10 minutes on every single pose that you're doing, you're way less attached to ruining the drawing. And when you do that, you get a lot of starts, and those starts help you actually make better finishes in the end of the day. Because when you get a lot of the problems in art start with the start. What happens is that you have some sort of minor or major proportional issue, whatever issue. Usually it's a drawing problem. And because of that, when you get later down the road, you don't really notice it at first. But when you get later down the road, that issue becomes extremely apparent. And then you have to redo the painting, you have to redraw the drawing, whatever. But if you do a lot of starts like this and you're not really afraid to draw over your painstaking work, then it's going to be a lot more beneficial for you in the long run. Now I can see that this leg, it's even more exaggerated than what I did. Something like really, really exaggerated like that. Like he has this, like, you can feel how much he's foisting up his leg, and that's because this really large curve, bam, right up here. And if you see a large curve, but it doesn't show up in the drawing, like for example, this isn't really that dark, right where the clothing kind of seams in. What you can do is that you can just lightly, not really put it in, but follow it and then start putting it in like I did there, right? And what that does is that it allows you to put in the tone where you need it, but it also lets you get the gesture to make the drawing flow a lot more. Now you can see Frazetta was really good at simplifying his shadow shapes and his light shapes, because not only did he design the shapes of the form and the figure and all that other stuff, but he was actually designing the shadow shapes, because when light hits form, for example, on the sphere we were talking about earlier, let's say it hits like right there. What happens is that you have a kind of moon shape, and then you also have a circle shape, and that tone creates two different shapes, right? You get this crescent shape and then you get the circle shape. So when you're creating light on form, you not only need to think about the anatomy and the design of the form, but you also need to think about the actual light and shadow shapes that you're making, and how to design those, how to make those simple, how to make those interlock in an interesting way, how to make those work with the general composition. Everything becomes extremely complex. And that's why art is just a very, very complex thing to comprehend all at once. You really need to break it down and simplify it. And that's why the most amazing artists are always super, super good at simplifying their drawings, and their compositions and all this other stuff. Because then they don't have to deal with how complicated the tones and the, colors and stuff gets. So you can see that I'm laying this tone really rapidly. It's not really a question of, oh, am I going to mess up? Am I going to go outside the line? No. Just got to put it in. If it's dark, just put it in dark. It's really that simple. And you can see that once we laid on these tones, we put in the shapes and all this other stuff, the gesture is still there under the drawing, right? It's not really, you're not going to see the gesture at the very end, but it's definitely going to influence the final product. And that's one of the wonderful things about it, and that's also part of the reason why it doesn't have to be perfect. Even if the proportion's a little bit off, you still get the general flow, and it ends up in your drawing. It ends up making things look a lot better. And you can see that a lot of things interconnect through the form here. Right through the shoulder, goes right through the leg, right? And when you're thinking about proportion and where things are lining up, and if you feel like your drawing is off, you should always be looking for those relative points. If you know that these line up, then you can just follow that in your drawing and you can see where you're making a mistake. That's always really helpful. All right, you guys, that's gonna be it for today. I hope you enjoyed just seeing these two little sketches that I did. I hope you learned a little bit about gesture, about how rhythms line up, how to design your figures to make a move. I hope you guys go make something beautiful. Have a great day. I'll see you later.